Hey everyone, this is Miss Saunders here, about to deliver the week 5 PowerPoint. So this week, the PowerPoint is kind of split up into two separate, yet of course also related concepts that we've been going over this week, which is the writing process for professional writing specifically, and also how to organize your text. So, how to think about organizing different types of professional text that you might be creating. And of course, this week you are writing a process essay, which is distinct from the writing process. You're going to actually be talking about a process at your business of your choice. So just wanted to review that very quickly before we started talking about the writing process for professional writing tasks. So our book, Better Business Writing, recommends dividing the writing process into separate tasks. And they tell you to be methodical at the beginning of your process. And I wanted to highlight this as someone who has often been disorganized at the beginning of my writing process and has paid the price later because I don't know where information is coming. I don't know where I got certain information. I've taken notes, but they're, not don't have citations. And if you were methodical and organized during your pre-writing stage, you really have yourself set up to write a good draft very quickly. So that's something I wanted to highlight. They recommend writing down 3 main points of your text and organizing them. This idea of 3 main points is something that's kind of echoed in both of our readings from this week. And I think, of course, you always want to think about your particular purpose, but 3 main points of thinking about writing 3 main points for different texts that you might create is a good kind of platform or starting base. And they recommend writing your draft completely your first time and then coming back afterwards to give it criticisms. So, kind of just pumping out that first draft and then coming back later with fresh eyes, clean eyes, and seeing what there is to clean up. So, in terms of revising, things to look for in revision would be organization of the text. You want to look specifically for writing for clarity and for wordiness in sentences. One thing that I recommend with students is to read your paper out loud to someone else, and you'd be surprised about all the things that you correct or all the things that you find that you need to correct. You want to look for the use of correct diction and syntax, and you also want to look for formatting and presentation and typos because, professional presentation is something that's really important, and you'd be surprised at how difficult that is to achieve because it just means attention to detail and it takes time. Another revision kind of tip is, asking feedback from others. They may be people at your work, it might be someone at home, might be a friend. But sometimes just having someone else's eyes on it, it's like you can automatically intuit how the reader is perceiving it from that other end of the tunnel. It's kind of the metaphor that we're using this semester. Yeah, you'd be surprised just having someone even next to you looking at it, and you're going to be able to intuit problems that the text has. They also might tell you some problems too, and that's always useful. It's always just useful to think about your language from the reader's perspective. So, questions to ask yourself during revision. Do I have 3 parts? That's pretty basic, thinking about cohesion. Have I made my points concretely and correctly? It's important to be concrete. Something we've talked about already this semester, just kind of, on certain occasions, letting the facts speak for themselves, but trying to avoid being too abstract and just be very, concrete or what's another word? Empirical, when you are making points and you are moving through data. Can I read this out loud to someone else and have them understand? So just envisioning your reader in all ways possible. And is the structure apparent to my reader? Have I used headings when appropriate? So ideally, you want to have a text that is easy to read and easy to follow. So is my structure apparent? That means, does one idea lead logically to the next? Have I used headings when it's kind of going into, headings or transitions when we're going into a new subject and it is appropriate to signal to a reader that a change is happening. Um, Use of pre-writing, that's something I'm a big advocate for. It almost seems like kind of an overlooked aspect of writing is all the work that you do when you get to the page. If you compare this idea of professional writing to, novel writing or creative writing, which I also have a background in. I was surprised talking to my friend who was writing a novel, who was talking about how most of his time he spends actually not putting any words on the page, but kind of doing that world building, building that background for the themes and ideas and the world he's creating. So, pre-writing for professional writing, of course, you're not going to have as long, you're not going to take months of pre-writing, but you want to take some time. And I think it helps avoid writer's block. And so by the time you get to the page, you're ready to go. Your pen can immediately start moving. So ways in which you can pre-write, aside from just kind of, thinking and spending time creating in your head what you're going to write about, you can do free writing. That's especially useful if you're having writer's block. You can just let yourself write, continuously for 3 minutes, 1 minute, 2 minutes. Also brainstorming, so kind of just doing that mental work of what do I need to do here? What do I need to achieve? What do I need to write to make it happen? Outlining is useful, and research is another way to kind of immerse yourself in what you're about to write about by kind of, you know, internalizing information and seeing how that information might help you create a useful or successful draft. So, insofar as transitioning from pre-writing to actual writing, I'm a not a stickler. I'm a big advocate for strong topic sentences, and I think they're important because the topic sentence of each paragraph sets up the main idea of the paragraph, and it also sometimes contains a transition from what's happening before, and sometimes you might have a header before your topic sentence, so there's kind of another signal to your reader. But basically, your topic sentences are doing work insofar as they're signaling to your reader what's about to happen. And that's important because you really want to guide your readers through the text. You don't want to just drop them off, in the middle of an intersection. If we're kind of using this car metaphor, you want to drive them all the way in front of the place where they're going and let them out right in front of the door. So you really want to think about guiding your reader and making sure that you are making it very easy for them to move from topic to topic and idea to idea. So better business writing suggests three main ideas. So that would be three main paragraphs for a text. But again, you might want to think about your different purpose for writing. You might want to have two main ideas, one main idea. I also would advise, in this kind of transition from pre-writing to actual writing, before you start writing your text, you would also write a topic sentence for your introduction and your conclusion. So that's kind of, again, just kind of building the skeleton of what you're writing. And then you want to pad in the details for the structure you've already created. So once you have all your topic sentences down, you've got the structure of your essay and you know what's going to happen, then you can start to add in those details and evidence and appeals and the language and the diction, the syntax, all the little things that make up the rest of it. But once you have the skeleton down, then you can kind of pad in the rest. So, some wisdom as we kind of move on into this, into now thinking about how we want to organize our text, right? And we kind of figure out the organization of text through drafting. So, in a way, the writing process is not, unrelated from this idea of organizing text, but the main wisdom about organization, which I've kind of already said, is that you need to guide your reader. As a writer, you need to have an idea of where you are currently and where you're going next. That means preparing the reader for what is coming next. So you really want to have I think an expert writer is someone who just has expert control over what they're saying and where they're going with their argument or with, their facts or with whatever they're saying. The expert writer is
deft in their ability to move from topic to topic, main idea to main idea, because they are, really upfront and letting the reader know I'm transitioning to something new and this is why. Um, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about that, but that's my basic wisdom about organizing your text. One thing you really want to think about is aesthetic of the text and visibility. So basically, the way it looks, how you're formatting it. Use white space, including paragraph breaks and margins. And you want to think about the strategic use of graphics. So when would a picture be best appropriate? There's that common adage, a picture is worth 1,000 words. I think sometimes graphics can say very simply what sometimes it could take quite a few bit of words to say. So if there's certain things that you want to highlight or illuminate, I think graphics are a really strong way to go. The use of headers to easily guide your reader, make the little sections very easy to glance. Professional writing, it's really considering the fact that time is of the essence. Everyone's on the clock, and you want to make your language, your writing, your text as easy to peruse and examine and just skim through as possible. Of course, the design you choose for your message depends on what you have to say. Um, that's, kind of if anything from this, if you glean anything from this course, it's kind of the fact that, suit your form of what you're writing to the particulars of your situation. And just the fundamental wisdom that the success of the message depends partially on how it looks. Does it look professional? Does it not have any typos? Is the formatting what one would expect in this type of document? And generally that means, single professional writing, you probably want to go with single spaced, although maybe some circumstances you want to do double spaced. You want to use a normal font like Times New Roman. You want to have smaller paragraphs, typically, and you want to, make use of your margins, and you just want to make sure everything is laid out on the page in an organized and aesthetically pleasing way. So, basic patterns of organizing text. So you can think about organizing your text chronologically. So in the book, they make the distinction of you can do it through chronologically through time versus space. So when you do chronological time, you can present the text. If you're explaining situation to the reader, you could tell them about the situation in the order in which things happened. Or you could talk about how things happened in one place then another. So that's one way of organizing. You can also do the flashback method, in which you state the current problem or crisis, and then you go back and fill the reader in on what has led up to that, and then go from there for subsequent developments. You want to use the pro-con presentation method, where you present strong points or assets and advantages, and then you want to also present the weak points or liabilities or disadvantages, and you kind of want to go about that in a comparative fashion. You can also just do a very functional style of organizing, which is by department. So you say, in this department, this happened, in this department, in this other thing happened, etc., etc. It just depends on what your particular professional situation is, where you work, how things are organized, and you want to keep those things all in mind, as well as keep in mind, the level of familiarity that your reader might have with the kind of conditions of your situation, to think about, okay, as I think about organizing this text, how am I going to organize it in a way that is best for my reader to understand it? And it might be different according to a different reader. You might choose the flashback method in one or chronological in another. Chronological is a way that seems to work naturally for a lot of people. Next we're going to go on to using markers. So we've talked about letting headers organize the text. Headers are definitely good for business writing, but not always academic writing, so kind of an important distinction to make there. It allows the reader to peruse the text easily. And one kind of tip is that
you can use, if you're making an outline, you can use the headers that make for your actual outline and insert them into the text. And that's keeping in mind that professional writing is always done on the clock, and usually you're working towards creating a certain text within a certain time. So there's always kind of that time factor to consider. So that might be ideally a little time saving tip. So thinking about the organization of your text and thinking about how there's natural emphasis, points of emphasis that occur by the way that you organize something. So there's always going to be an emphasis on whatever comes last. However, whatever catches the eye first keeps the reader reading. So in terms of like making a professional recommendation, you might want to, or just your final thesis or conclusion, you might want to think about whether it's more advantageous for you to make it at the beginning or the end. Ultimately, the situation is the controlling factor. Um, and yeah, I mean, I typically like to use information to definitely draw the reader in the beginning. I think that's important because whatever happens in the beginning keeps the reader going. Um, so these are just kind of points to consider. There's never one way to do it every time, but there are natural elements in organization that lead to certain emphasis at natural times, and you want to think about, based on the information that I have now, what is the best way to organize it. And a lot of organization is just kind of an intuitive way of you fielding or sorting through the material in hopes that it will make sense for your reader on the other end. And, don't forget to get feedback because your intuition is usually, going to be correct, but you want to make sure that you're getting some feedback from others before you kind of go and send it off. Unless you feel like you have a ton of experience and you have a lot of confidence in your ability to organize a topic well. Um, Another thing to think about, when I teach critical writing or rhetoric classes, we talk a lot about like a hook, which is like a catchy sentence or quotation or something that's used to like draw the reader in. So if you don't feel like you want to make your recommendation or final conclusion at the beginning, you can think of a clever way to kind of grasp your reader's attention and pique their interest without necessarily giving away the final goods because you want to leave it at the end as sort of a natural way to emphasize your main point. So a quote we have here that was in Writing for Business this week that I think kind of warrants further attention is mere arrangement is not method. And that was from Coleridge, who's actually a poet. I studied poetry as well, so I'm obviously interested in this. But I think this is a good point. It's like just to arrange. If you think about it as a vase of flowers, your text is a vase of flowers. Just arranging the flowers and just putting them, at different places in the vase is not going to be the most successful way to present them, right? You need to present the flowers tastefully. In terms of thinking about like ideas and combining different ideas in text, self-evident connections versus moments where the reader needs explicit direction. So there are some topics that are going to naturally lead from one to another, and there are going to be moments when you're taking the text in a different direction and you are going to need a signal to the reader to show them I am transitioning, whether that be a header, whether it be a header, a transition sentence. But these are things that you need to think about as you are creating a text because you don't want to make your reader feel jarred or kind of struggling to understand how one thing goes naturally to another. And it's something that I find when I'm reading like an A-level essay, I feel like it's very easy to follow along. I know exactly where I'm going, and I have no problems following the logic of the piece. When I'm reading an essay that's maybe not in maybe a B or a C or a D, I'm having to go back and try to understand how one topic led to the next, where I am. I sometimes feel, kind of let out in the middle of the street, so to speak. I'm not in front of my destination. I'm confused. So these are, things to think about as you're writing and how to best guide your reader. Sometimes, your own experience working through the data of everything you've gleaned and learned kind of will reveal the right route. So that means kind of like maybe when you write your first draft, you kind of just
allow yourself to spit it all out, and that process of you working through the problem or kind of coming to an understanding of it, that will lead to a natural organization that is easy for the reader to follow. And that's what I kind of mean by letting your intuition kind of guide your organization of the text. Of course, when you revise, you might want to think, hey, I can make that transition better, etc. But that's one example of one way to experiment with organizing your professional text. So this is what slide we're looking at here. This is a quote from the Writing for Business chapter. This was a part in it, and it was an excerpt. And so this is called Mechanics. And we see after, that's the header, and then we see there is no excuse for me to misspell words. Early papers in the course contain glaring mistakes in grammar. So the fact that this quote is in the book is kind of emphasizing how important it is to be grammatically correct and have error-free text in professional settings, because your presentation of text is really like your professional signature. But also we see how basically this author of this segment here is not signaling to the reader what's happening next in the correct way. So this actually segment is quite confusing to read. So what happens when the title is Mechanics, the author really meant that he's discussing individual aspects of mechanics in writing as a whole. So the transition kind of breaks down because there is no unifier from the part that's at the top in bold and what comes next. There's no natural transition. So the word mechanics, I'm not sure exactly what he means by that, or she, depending on who wrote this. But then when we go into there is no excuse for me to misspell words, early papers and the course contain glaring mistakes in grammar. Okay, now I understand what kind of mechanics they mean, but I have to go back to the beginning and be like, oh, that type of mechanics. So you see, so the kind of comprehension on behalf of the reader is counterintuitive, because I don't really understand what's happening until I've gone back to the beginning. So that's just one example of a transition or organization that isn't working. So hopefully that gives you some idea of how to avoid making similar mistakes in your own writing. So when organizing, you want to think about your reader, begin where her or he will begin, work your way through the material as he or she would. You want to anticipate counter arguments. You want to try to introduce the first things first. That seems like kind of an obvious statement, but if you just think about, okay, what does the reader need to understand on a basic level? What comes first? What piece of evidence or information needs to come at the beginning? You want to make maximum use of the beginning and end, because those are the points of natural emphasis. And you want to repeat content, not words, strategically. So just this idea of repetition of content, not words. You can repeat the same idea at strategic points to kind of remind your reader of it, especially if it's important, but you don't want to use the exact same diction or syntax again and again. So you want to say the same thing, but you want to use new words to say it. And of course, what you express will be slightly different, because what you express will be inflected with how you write it. But generally, the message should be about the same. You're kind of saying the same thing, you're just using different words and different sentence structure to describe it. So that's important. So also something to think about is the use of I. I think using I is a natural way to communicate in professional settings, but beware of using it too often. Sometimes you can use the passive voice or move the I away from the beginning of the sentence so it doesn't attract too much attention. Always useful to consider using the name of the company or persons who you're addressing as well. So, and that's just to kind of show them that you are thinking about who you're corresponding with or who you're addressing. If that is the case, of course, if you are corresponding with someone or you are addressing someone else. When I've worked as a technical writer, something that we thought about for like government proposals is if we are writing a proposal, say we want to write towards the city of St. Tammany, and I'm writing a proposal to them, I want to make sure I use the city of St. Tammany or St. Tammany, I'm sorry, the parish, St. Tammany Parish. Um, I want to use that phrase as much as I use my own name, because by doing that, I'm showing that I am kind of interested, in my reader, that they are important to me. And while I don't think you need to go that far in your own writing, I think it's something that's in professional writing, it's good to consider. If you're addressing another person at another business or another company, you want to think about, emphasizing their name. And it just seems to make people happy. It's kind of, I guess, people want to feel important. Um, all right, have a beginning, middle, and end. Be sure to point out any logical divisions between the parts. So when you introduce something, when you transition, you want to, if there's a point where the logic is going in a different direction, you want to point that out, and you want to guide your reader through the transition. You also want to point out connections and internal relationships between content. So in summary, or to conclude, I should say, so Philip Sporn of American Electric Power Company said, "Writing is a mold poured around the ideas in the mind of the writer. No successful writing can be called that unless what comes out of the mold fits exactly the ideas originally entertained by the writer." So basically what's happening here is they're talking about achieving accuracy through craft. And that means achieving accuracy in what you're expressing by organizing it well. So organization is a part of that craft, and it's an important part. Ideally what we've learned this week is thinking about how to accurately or best express something by organizing it in the best way possible. All right, everyone, that's the summary that's kind of the end of my elaborations on some of the concepts for this week. I hope that you have found it to be helpful.